In the chilly night breeze, the feathers drifted downward like a fleeting dream. A feather landed on Victor's palm. He gazed down at it for a long while, as if wanting to etch the small white silhouette into his memory. Before she left, the girl asked him, what would he be without all the burdens of the outside world? Perhaps he'd be like this feather, he thought, light, tiny, blending in with the countless other feathers at his feet, lying quietly in the boundless night. At this moment, like everyone else, he remained in place, listening to the clock tick down. It was doomsday, but he believed that he'd be spared. Yet, what would happen after that? A gust of wind blew the feather away. Victor watched it slowly glide to the ground and sighed. He said he trusted the girl and her powers, but he couldn't help but worry. He had waited so long for his miracle, yet she alone would be facing this global catastrophe. What price would she have to pay? He took out his pocket watch. The crack, once so frightening to look at, had been mended by the passage of time. He slid one finger down the shiny glass surface and noticed for a split second a glint of light that did not belong to the eternal night. Time and space seemed to distort all at once. Soon, he found himself in a different place. He knew the street. He knew the traffic lights. It was a scene that he had revisited thousands of times in his head. He sighed in relief. Peace had returned to Loveland City. The sun was shining, and random citizens came in and out of the corner supermarket. She had done it, just as he'd always believed she could. But on closer inspection, Victor realized that something was off. A quick glance at the LFG building told him that it now had fewer floors, and that the exterior glass facade was missing. This was still the LFG building, but back when it had just been built. Had he returned to the past? Why would his pocket watch bring him here? Before Victor could take his eyes off the building, it suddenly began to rain. He sought refuge under a ledge, and at that very moment saw a petite figure walk by. Victor froze. The girl was heading towards the crossroads. Her face was a bit more innocent than he remembered. When she reached the road, she stared blankly at the other side, took a step forward, then hesitated as if thinking through a difficult decision. Following the direction of her gaze, Victor saw himself, but from a few years ago. Carefully searching the fragments in his memory, he tried to remember if he had seen the girl during the time frame between the kidnapping in his childhood and the time he saved her in the road that day. As far as he knew, he hadn't. The traffic lights blinked and turned red. The girl remained in the same place while Victor's younger self began to walk forward. Confused, Victor watched the scene unfold. Had he really passed by her unknowingly in those 17 years? He tried to move closer to get a better look, but found that an invisible barrier seemed to be holding him back, repelling his existence there. As if in answer to his prayers, the world suddenly fell silent, and time seemed to stand still. Behind him, someone tugged at his sleeve. He turned around to find an oddly dressed boy gazing up at him.
It's better to not let her see you.
The little boy, who appeared to be around 7 or 8 years old, smiled up at him. His words held a certain gravity that made him seem mature for his age.
Don't worry. This is indeed the world you were in, and you successfully traveled to the future of this world.
The boy pointed behind him.
However, two versions of the same person cannot exist in the same world at once, so you won't be able to do anything here, and you can't stay for long.
Victor frowned and crouched down beside the boy.
Who are you? And why do you know all this?
I know everything about this world. I also know what brought you here.
The boy blinked at him and tilted his head slightly to one side.
You're very clever, but the future is ever-changing. If you're unprepared, things won't go your way.
The boy's grin faded away slowly. Victor gazed into his eyes, which seemed to reflect the turbulent lights and shadows of the entire world. Finally, he stood up and nodded.
I see.
The boy smiled once more, and, as if sensing that his time was up, he waved goodbye. Victor was instantly dragged back into the vortex of time and space, with just enough time to cast one last longing glance at the familiar crossroads. In the scene he had just witnessed, the two were about to miss each other. It was seared into his memory. He understood that every choice led to different outcomes, but this was one thing he couldn't afford to get wrong. Back in the present, Victor couldn't help feeling a bit wistful. He'd think about the future too sometimes, of course. Happy futures, sad ones. The one thing they all had in common was that he'd meet her in every one of these futures. But if he hadn't met her, if it were just her against the whole world. He had never doubted, even once, that she'd become stronger and more capable after facing the greatest threat to the world. But, in fact, the world didn't end. There was still a future that held countless unpredictable dangers, and he'd already promised her that he would never let her face them alone. There was no new crack on the pocket watch. He had another chance, to be sure, to visit an even further future. Victor activated his evol once more, watching the hands of the pocket watch spin as years and years flew by in a flash. The moment he stepped through the vortex, a crack appeared on the watch, spreading and eventually overtaking the entire surface. Every inch of his skin seemed to be tearing apart, a feeling he was all too familiar with, and a heavy weight pressed against his chest. It was as if he was swimming against the tide in turbulent waters. What should have been a silent space was filled with ear-splitting screams. In the face of insurmountable pain, most would have backed down, but Victor's final shreds of consciousness reminded him that there was no time to waste. He had to reach his destination before doomsday. Victor's shirt was drenched with sweat by the time everything finally quieted down. He took a few deep breaths, leaning against the wall next to him, waiting for the fog in his head to dissipate. When he regained his vision, he carefully opened his palm to check on the watch. Luckily, the watch was still intact. He had made the right call. Victor observed his surroundings. He appeared to be in the inpatient department of a hospital. The corridor was empty, so the moment he turned his head, he easily saw the girl headed in his direction. Victor swiftly concealed himself behind a corner and watched her enter a ward. She was just like he remembered, but her expression was more confident, and she sounded polite and self-assured when she spoke to the patient in the room. Victor smiled softly. He didn't realize it himself, but his eyes were full of pride and relief. After a while, the girl opened the door and left with a frown, as if deep in thought. Soon after, a medical device could be heard beeping from inside the ward. The girl rushed back into the room, and a dark silhouette flashed into view, charging straight towards her with a weapon. "Watch out!" Victor cried out reflexively, and the girl responded, turning to run in his direction. He was so close to changing the outcome, but the beeping resumed, and the girl turned back to look. The figure, clad in black, face indistinguishable, was gaining on her. The sharp blade glinted ominously in his hand. In this moment, time seemed to freeze. It was as if his blood had frozen too. The pain that had softened by the passage of time suddenly assaulted his senses once more. It had been such a long time, yet his mind had only ever been fixated on one thing. He wanted her to live, to be safe. No matter what happened to the world, he wanted to meet her again. But now his greatest fear was coming true. He didn't actually see it happen, for the watch in his hand had dragged him back into the vortex, not allowing them to meet. But just seeing her in danger was enough to bring all his fears and insecurities to the surface. This was not the future he wanted to see. He refused to accept it. Even if there was only a scant possibility of it happening, he would never allow it. Piercing pain enveloped his throbbing heart. He closed his eyes, allowing the tides of time to bring him back to the present. The pain made it all too clear that he needed to be more prepared. When Goldman received Victor's call, the end was fast approaching, and as usual, he acted swiftly. The task Victor assigned him wasn't difficult. He was to contact an evolver with the power to transmit sound. Goldman knew this person. He was a member of No Man's Island, and his contact info should be on the list. Suddenly, his phone vibrated, and his eyes widened in surprise. It was a message from Victor. "Sorry," it said. "I didn't want to trouble you at a time like this." The CEO rarely ever talked like this. He may be strict, but he would never assign pointless tasks. There were times when he had asked Goldman to help with his private arrangements, but he'd never call it trouble. After a brief hesitation, Goldman typed a quick reply.
"No problem. It's the least I can do."
Perhaps, knowing that most people would have to start afresh due to uncontrollable forces, many had stopped bothering to act polite or forge relationships. But that went against Goldman's life philosophy. Someone asking him for a favor, even a small one, made him feel that he was still needed in the world. His life had meaning that way. Victor walked out of the bathroom and changed into a clean shirt. Upon his return to the present from that future hospital scene, he was very weak, slumping against his desk and sending a stack of files toppling to the floor. Among those files was a list. It was a member list from No Man's Island, detailing the identity and ability of every member. Victor's gaze swept through the records, finally resting on the name of an evolver that had once intrigued him. The pocket watch could no longer take any more pressure, and doomsday was around the corner. He couldn't be sure of how he'd change when that moment came, so he needed to act fast. Goldman's message arrived right on cue. He had made contact with the evolver, who happened to be at Floral Road. Victor asked Goldman to give the evolver the address to Souvenir, which was not far from Floral Road, and they could meet up there. There wasn't much time left, but there was enough. There had to be something he could do. When Victor arrived, Souvenir was closed for business. A young man was sitting at an outdoor table scrolling on his phone. He blinked in surprise when he saw Victor.
You're the boss of No Man's Island? Aren't you the guy that's always in the news?
Nice to meet you. I'm Victor.
Seeing Victor's extended hand, the young man quickly put down his phone and took his hand in a firm grip. As more and more meteors shot through the sky, the two knew they had to cut straight to the point. In short, the young man had the ability to send a voice message to a designated person at a designated time. Although any time point could be selected, one could only leave a limited number of messages within a specific time span. Seeing Victor's deepening frown, the young man tried to explain it further.
It's like a paper cup phone. My evol is like the string that connects the two paper cups. It's just a string, though, so the message won't be as clear as if the two sides were talking face to face.
Victor thought for a moment and then nodded.
So, how many messages can I send?
In the time frame that you want, probably 4. Maybe 5 if I try really hard.
Thank you.
The young man studied Victor. He didn't seem one bit hesitant. Was he not worried about what his messages might change?
Mr. CEO, are you doing this because you're sure we can all survive this doomsday?
Yes.
How can you be sure?
Because I saw the future.
The young man was momentarily stunned.
But even if you successfully send the messages, the future still might not develop in the way you want it to.
Victor gazed at him. Or was he gazing at someone else, someone he never stopped thinking about?
It doesn't matter. We have a long future ahead of us. I can be patient.
He would always wait patiently for her. The young man unlocked his phone and handed it to Victor.
I'll tell you when to start, and you can just say your message like you're calling someone.
Victor took the phone and stared at the empty call interface. For important messages, he'd much prefer to relay them face to face. But it's undeniable that a time difference could exist between people, and as the little boy said, most things were determined by chance. They wouldn't go as you wish with just one try. He didn't care how many times he tried or the methods he used. The result was the only thing that mattered to him. The young man began to channel his ability. A gentle fizzling of electricity sounded next to Victor's ears, and light ripples coursed through the phone interface. A feather drifted down from nowhere, landing unassumingly on the table. The evening breeze nudged it towards Victor's hand, tickling his pinky finger. Victor's fingers curled. He could almost feel the girl's slender pinky finger hooked on his own as she went on about all sorts of promises. They still had so many promises yet to be fulfilled, and to fulfill them, they must meet again.
Time point locked on. Ready, Mr. CEO?
Victor snapped back to reality and pressed the phone next to his ear. The youth cleared his throat and closed his eyes.
Miss, I have a message for you from the past. Mr. Victor, go ahead.
Remembering the hesitant girl standing at the crossroads, Victor smiled faintly.
Dummy. What are you hesitating for?
The doomsday bells tolled. The end had come. The meteor showers were like matches, lighting up the darkness and illuminating the eternal night. Victor looked up. The skies were as bright as day, and an almost transparent shower of light had shrouded the city. His body felt strangely weightless, as if his powers, flowing in his veins, were responding to the summons of some faraway entity. The hands of the clock tower froze in place for a brief moment, and then ticked once. Backwards.